The background for this game is intense. This is Bobby Fischer facing Mikhail Botvinnik. And for those of you who don't know, Botvinnik is one of the most important figures in the history of chess by being the leader, sort of the godfather of the Soviet chess school. He sort of brought chess into a professional realm so that players had a real professional attitude towards the game. And with his teachings, the Soviet Union dominated chess for decades. And it is that environment that Bobby Fischer entered into. Now, this is 1962. The idea that a young Fischer could take on the godfather of Soviet chess was really unheard of. And Fischer is paired against him in Bulgaria, which was not a Soviet country, but was part of the Eastern Bloc and connected to the Soviet Union geographically and in terms of the foreign policy and so forth. So it was friendly ground for Botvinnik and dangerous ground for the young Fischer, who has black in this game. Botvinnik with white begins with the English opening, c4. Fischer plays his famous, well, it's not the, I was going to say the famous King's Indian. He played the Grunfeld in this game, which he played from time to time. And this is an aggressive opening. Fischer is not backing down. He's challenging Botvinnik directly with d5. Knight to f3 from Botvinnik, usually cd5, that's the sharpest main line. But knight f3 from Botvinnik, bishop to g7, queen to b3. We see white trying to put as much pressure on d5 as possible, also some indirect pressure on b7 from the queen. Fischer takes, queen takes, castles, and e4. And just to look at the position, white looks better with a nice full pawn center. But that's the idea behind the Grunfeld. Black lets white get a nice big center and then attacks it with all of his might. One of black's problems is his king is in the middle of the board, and it stays there for a while. Bishop to g4 from Fischer, trying to undermine a defender of the d4 pawn and square. Bishop to e3. Botvinnik doesn't mind if Fischer takes that knight. In fact, after this position, white has a really big plus score, 2 bishop advantage, a nice center. So here Fischer plays an interesting move, knight f to d7. He moves a piece twice in the opening, but it accomplishes so much. It unblocks the powerful g7 bishop. The knight can support either a c5 or an e5 push to attack the center, and if it goes to b6, it gains a tempo against the queen at c4. Bishop to e2, knight to c6, rook to d1. Botvinnik knows he has to defend d4 with all of his might. That's the key to his position. Knight to b6 hits the queen goes to c5, and here Fischer plays queen to d6, willing to trade queens because he has less space. If white were to do that, then he could take with the e-pawn or the c-pawn, and this is an equal position. Black is fine here. So Botvinnik avoids that. He plays h3, asking the bishop what it wants to do. Bishop takes knight, and if bishop takes, then after queen c5, black gets a nice position. Pawn takes, then knight to c4 hits the bishop and the b2 pawn. After bishop c1, Fischer is doing very well in that position. So Botvinnik takes with the pawn. And again, notice, even though he has the bishop pair and a nice center, his king is still in the middle of the board. And Botvinnik was known, he was one of the first elite players who developed a delaying of castling as a strategy. And this game is no exception. He's delaying castling a long time. Rook f to d8, piling onto that d4 square, bishop, queen, rook, and knight at c6, all aiming at d4. And because of that pressure, Botvinnik advances that pawn, knight to e5, and now knight to b5. Now this looks really good for white. It looks like Fischer's in big trouble, but he keeps finding moves. The knight hits the queen and the pawn at c7. Computers like the idea of exchanging queens and then playing c6 as a way of trying to save material. But Fischer plays a more aggressive move. He plays the move queen to f6 with a double attack on f3, threatening knight takes f3, check. So Botvinnik plays f4, gaining more space, but again, he has to worry about his king a little bit. The knight comes back to d7, attacking the queen, but Botvinnik ignores the threat to his queen and plays e5. If he takes on c7, then after queen b2, Fischer's doing well. So he plays e5. These beautiful pawns in the center look dominating, but Fischer, realizing he's threatening Botvinnik's queen, plays the strong move, queen takes f4. And what that does is, not only does it gain the pawn at f4, but it distracts this bishop from defending the queen on c5. So after bishop takes, knight takes queen. Now these pawns are advanced, but they're quite vulnerable. This pawn is attacked twice. The one on d5 is attacked twice. Knight takes c7, rook a to c8, and d6. And this pawn at d6, it looks very scary. This is one of White's main strategies in the Grunfeld, is to get a central pawn majority and advance that pawn right up the board. Botvinnik is doing that successfully, but Fischer has good pieces, and again, a safer king. Fischer takes on d6, and now bishop takes b2. Fischer gains a pawn, an important pawn. Finally, Botvinnik castles. Fischer plays knight b to d7 to blockade this pawn at d6. Rook to d5 to put some pressure on the knight. So b6 protects that knight. Bishop to f3, and now a very good move from Fischer. Knight to e6, challenging the knight at c7 and threatening the bishop at f4. So Botvinnik has to do something about that. He takes the knight, pawn takes knight, the rook has to move, and then Fischer plays knight to c5, hitting the rook, but also unveiling a threat of the rook, black's rook on the d6 pawn. The rook moves, and now Fischer gives up a weak pawn, this weak pawn at e6, but he's able to capture the d6 pawn. He plays e5, interfering with the bishop's protection of the d6 pawn. Bishop takes e5, bishop takes, rook takes, and now the very dangerous d6 pawn is off the board, and we can look at this. Fischer is up a pawn, and his knight is probably as nice as that bishop. The bishop has an open board, but the knight is well placed and protected. Fischer also has a healthier pawn structure. Botvinnik has 3 isolated pawns. Fischer has 2 pawn islands. Botvinnik plays rook to e7. The rook goes on the 7th. Fischer can't allow that rook to hang around, so he challenges it. Rook to d7. The rook come off. And now bishop to g4 from Botvinnik. Maybe he wants to take that knight off the board, thinking the rook endgame is more drawish than the knight and rook versus bishop and rook. Rook endgames do definitely have drawish tendencies, but you have to be careful. Fischer plays rook to c7 to move out of the pin. And here, if Botvinnik had taken the knight, black is better here. I mean, he's got a healthy extra pawn, better pawn structure, and would have real chances to win this position. So Botvinnik plays rook to e1, wanting to obviously play the rook to e7 and pile on the pinned knight. King to f7 keeps the rook out of that square. King to g2, the knight moves back to that nice c5 perch. Rook to e3, this controls the knight, keeps it out of e3, and also, or d3. And by controlling the e-file, Fischer's king can't cross that line. The rook keeps the king from moving. So Fischer challenges that rook with rook to e7 so that his king can start to move. Botvinnik does not want to trade rooks. The minor piece ending would probably be harder for white than the rook ending would be. Rook f3 check, king to g7, rook to c3, rook to e4, activating the rook, perhaps wanting to shift over and put some pressure on the a2 pawn. Bishop to d1. This is a maneuver with Botvinnik's bishop to control some of the squares that this knight can go to. Rook to d4, bishop to c2, controlling those key squares. King to f6. Fischer begins to get his king into the game. King to f3. Now king to g5 with the threat of king to h4 and putting pressure on the h3 pawn. So Botvinnik goes back to g3. But notice the reference here between the rook and the king. A knight on e4 would fork them, and that would force a rook endgame. So Fischer has a big decision to make, and he goes ahead and does that. Maybe it helped Botvinnik, it's hard to say, but that makes sure that he has a pure rook endgame. Bishop takes e4, rook takes e4. Now both sides make 2 moves that are probably, each one makes an imprecise move. The best move for white is probably rook to c7 with an attack on h7 and a7. But instead he plays the rook to a3. And the best move here, according to computers, is a5, limiting the scope of the rook and getting this 2-to-1 majority moving. But Fischer plays the rook back to e7. So probably not quite as precise as a5. rook to f3, rook to c7, a4, rook to c5, wanting to control this square and move his rook to the square. Rook to f7, attacking h7 and a7, rook to a5, allowing Botvinnik to take the h7 pawn, but Fischer wants to take the pawn at a4, so rook takes h7, rook takes a4. h4 check, king to f5, rook f7, king e5. The rook irritates that pawn at g6. If king to f6, rook to b7, white is doing okay in his attempts to hold this position. So Fischer plays rook to a1, king to f3, and this moment is important because this is the last move before the time control. Back in 1962, they had adjournments, which means once the game reached a certain point of a certain amount of time had elapsed, they would stop playing and then come back and finish the game the next day. Obviously, with computers, you could never do that today. But and what would happen is they would study that position all night long. And this next move from Fischer is his last move before that adjournment. And now, Botvinnik wouldn't know what move he played. He would seal it in an envelope and find out the next day. Fischer plays the move b5. And Fischer at first thought this was a mistake, but on later analysis realized it probably was as good as anything. Botvinnik has to guess at Fischer's move, but he does analyze this move. And when he came back to the board the next day, Botvinnik's move, he plays a brilliant shot. He plays this move h5. This does a couple of things. One, after the exchange, it clears the way for the rook to come to g5 with check, where it hits this pawn and would hit the pawn at h5. But more importantly, he's shifting this pawn to the rook file. And with this pawn on the rook file, draws are easier. Drawish formations are just easier for white to create in that position. Rook to a3 check was first played by Fischer. King to g2, pawn takes. And now rook to g5 check, king to d6. And remember, we talked about how the rook pawns it's easier to hold a draw. So Botvinnik does not take the pawn at h5, but instead takes the b5 pawn. h4 from Fischer, f4. Here's Botvinnik's idea: to use this pawn as a distraction and that way keep this king occupied. As it turns out, I think this is actually technically a draw, even without that pawn even being on the board. But that pawn definitely helps Botvinnik. King to c6, rook to b8, h3 check. Botvinnik's precision in endgames was legendary. a5, f5. King to e6, rook to b6 check, king to f7. And you just see how this is. This king has to tend to the pawn, and this rook has to tend to both of these pawns, and it's just too much. There's no way Fischer can make progress here. King to g6, rook to a6, I should say. King to g6, rook to c6, and he just keeps this rook back and forth. And again, even if he allowed black to take here, this is still a draw. It would take a long video to explain why, but it is a draw. Rook to c6, and they just move back and forth for a few more moves. And in this position, they agreed to a draw with the rook tied down to the pawns and the king tied down to the pawn at f6. Nevertheless, when you consider that Fischer came in, faced the greatest player probably in the world at that point, was able to put a lot of pressure on him with the black pieces on his home turf, that was when I think the world knew that the Fischer Revolution was on its way, that he could really take on the Soviet chess empire and win. Hope you've enjoyed this video. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.